Hey guys, welcome to Franklin Woodworks. I'm going to build a table, well actually two tables, but I'll explain that a little later. The first table is a cocktail height table similar to a high top at a restaurant. It's going to be painted white, so I chose poplar as the construction material. All of the poplar I had on hand was 4/4, so I planed it all smooth, which left me with stock a little greater than 3/4 of an inch thick. I glued my stock together for the legs, and the plan is for the legs to be roughly 2.5 by 2.5 square. While that's drying, I cut the stock for the aprons. Once I get the stock to the correct width, to 4 inches, I head over to the miter saw to cut them to rough length. Next, I cut the stock for the stretchers, which I cut at 2 inches, and I cut them to rough length at the miter saw also. For the top, I use a glue line rip blade to true up the stock. I'm not concerned with the dimensions of each board since it's going to be painted. I just wanted to make sure I have the perfect glue joints. To make sure the top is perfectly flat, I use straight edges as cauls during the glue up. Once the legs are dry, I send them through the planer to get them all the same dimension. I stagger the legs as I run them through to minimize the snipe. With the legs now square, I use my table saw sled to square up one end. Then clamping the squared ends together, I can make one cut and all the legs are the same exact length, which is 42.5 inches. I line up my mark with the kerf on my sled and make the cut. Now for something fun. I'm going to taper 2 sides of each leg. I'm going to use my joiner to do this. It may be a little hard to see, but I've determined the spot where the blades begin cutting, and I've drawn a line on my fence to indicate that spot. Then I determined the length of the taper and divided that number in half. I attached a stop block on the fence so that the workpiece will stop at half the length of the taper. Because I want the taper to be a total of 1/2 of an inch, I set the infeed bed of the joiner at 1/4 of an inch. The formula is actually easy when you consider that once you determine the length and size of your taper, cut all of those numbers in half. I also marked each corner of the workpiece, and that's just so I don't mess up which sides are going to have the taper. This will be important later on when I do the joinery for the aprons. I run the 2 sides of the workpiece through the joiner, stopping at the stop block and lifting the piece straight up. You could also just turn the joiner off at the end of each pass and wait for the blades to stop spinning before you remove the workpiece. But since my power switch is below the bed of the joiner, I didn't want to risk accidentally shifting the workpiece while reaching for the switch. Once I've done 2 sides of each workpiece, it's time to complete the taper. I've removed the stop block so I can run the piece all the way through, this time in the other direction. Holding the pressure on the rear of the piece so that the piece is canted upwards, I run the piece through the joiner and this completes the taper. Safety is a key concern with this operation. I rehearsed this several times before I actually did it, and you are witnessing the first time I did it with the machine running. When you're taking that big of a bite out of the workpiece, it takes a lot of lateral force. The push blocks I normally use with my joiner didn't have enough grip and tended to slip. I finally made the determination that it would be safer to go without the push blocks and just make sure not to get my fingers close to the blades. Now that I'm editing this video and I've got a little hindsight, I realize I should have made a modified push stick similar to what I use with the table saw. This would have given me downward and lateral force necessary to make the cut safely. so now I know for next time. Now I can start the joinery. I'll be using dowels to connect the aprons to the legs, so here I'm drilling the holes for the dowels using a dowel max. On the legs, I offset the holes for the dowels so that the aprons are inset 1/4 inch. For the stretchers, I use a length of wood as my guide just to make sure there were no mistakes with measuring. With all of the joinery cut, it's time to give everything a round over. I do all 4 sides of the legs and stretchers, but only the bottom corners of the aprons. And the dry fit went off without a hitch. But remember I said I'm making 2 tables? Well, actually no. But the need for the white cocktail table went away, and since I didn't have a use for one, I decided to make an end table out of what I had. I recut the legs to a much shorter length and recut 2 of the aprons so the table would be a rectangle instead of a square. All that was easy enough, but white just isn't in the decor of my house, so I tried an experiment. The poplar I used was a range of white, green, and purple, so a normal staining didn't seem to be a viable option. I needed it to be the color of dark cherry, which was popular in the 90s when we acquired most of our other furniture. I used a mixture of red mahogany and dark vintage maple trans-tint dye in denatured alcohol. Once that was done, I glued up the legs and the aprons. To make sure everything was square, I used a clamp on a diagonal to pull in the offending angles. I recut the top to the new correct size and gave the edge a nice profile with the router. Because I didn't want to risk burning the edges and having to contend with sanding out the burn on an odd profile, I took a light pass before running the edge flush against the router bit's guide bearing. This worked out very well. Since the top is what everyone will touch, it has to be sanded perfect, so I used my normal method of putting light pencil marks as I go through the grits. When all of the pencil marks are gone, I can move to the next grit. This ensures a nice even sanding. Then I noticed a problem. Even though I dyed the wood as dark as I could, I was still not happy with the overall color. The combination of the natural variations in the poplar as well as all of the lamination was still way too obvious, and it wasn't as dark as it needed to be. I was able to solve this by also using 1 coat of General Finishes Java Gel Stain. The combination was absolutely the perfect color, though admittedly it was sheer luck. Now I could put the table together and start the finishing. For the bottom of the table, I used satin spray lacquer. Now, since I'm not an accomplished furniture builder, I needed something fairly idiot-proof. But the top needed to be a little more durable with a thicker finish. So for the top, I used a brushing lacquer. To attach the top, I made clips out of some aluminum stock I had on hand. After cutting them to size, I drilled 1 hole at the end and 2 holes really close together at the other end. With the aluminum clamped in a vise, a small file allowed me to join the holes drilled close together into a slot. This will allow for any wood movement once the table is put together. The single holes were given a countersink so that the screws would be flush to the surface. But the attachment clips also needed to be flush, so I need to cut a mortise in the aprons. I marked each location out with a marking knife, tracing the outside of the clip. Then I used a trim router to make the mortise. I pre-drilled for the screws and tightened them by hand. With the table upside down, I centered the leg assembly, marked each hole, and pre-drilled for the screws, which were also tightened by hand. So here's the end result. It's a very plain but functional end table, although it kind of looks like a piano bench. Is it fine furniture? Absolutely not. But I learned a ton during this project, and I won't be afraid to tackle a more ornate table in the future. I'd appreciate it if you would hit the like button, and please hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. I'd also appreciate your gently and kindly worded comments if you're so inclined. Thanks for watching, and there you go.